The river roared after a storm that had raged through the entire night, its murky and furious water twisting around the rocks, as if it intended to swallow the world whole. Most people kept their distance, hiding inside their houses with the doors shut tight, but a little girl in a yellow raincoat ran toward the rushing water. Her tiny sneakers pressed into the wet mud, slipping, falling, then rising again as she moved toward the strange sound she had just heard. And then she saw a hand, only a single hand, thrashing desperately above the violent current. A man was drowning, panicked and sinking, fighting for his life. "Hold on," she cried, her small voice trembling yet unwavering. Her feet braced against the slick ground as she gripped a broken branch left behind by last night's storm, leaning dangerously close to the edge. There was no one else around, no adults, no rescue workers, no time to wait. Only a child and a grown man on the brink of death. She pulled with all her strength, the branch shaking wildly in her hands, and she screamed again. Fear and determination tangled in her voice as she refused to let go. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and then at last the water surrendered. The man was thrown onto the bank, collapsing as he coughed violently, drenched and gasping for breath. When he finally looked up, he saw the face of the person who had saved him. An innocent child, anxious and unaware that she had just rescued the most wanted man in the entire state of Vermont, the one federal and local authorities had hunted for many years. The man who commanded the largest underground network on the eastern seaboard, Nathaniel Callahan. Yet in that moment his eyes no longer belonged to a cold-blooded criminal. Something flickered deep within them, something no one had ever witnessed in him before, a quiet gratitude and an unspoken promise. What he chose to do after that would astonish anyone who believed they already understood the kind of man he was. In this moment, when the story is just beginning to open its first tender knots of emotion, if you are watching and feel your heart stir at the bravery of little Sophie or at the first flicker of change within the man named Nate, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like and share to help this story travel even farther. Do not hesitate to leave a comment below to tell us where you are listening from, which city you call home, or which quiet corner of the world you are in, so we can see how far this story has reached and whose hearts it has touched. Thank you for staying with us up to this moment, and please continue walking beside us through the unexpected chapters that lie ahead. Nathaniel lay motionless on the frozen riverbank, his chest heaving in heavy, uneven waves as the last of his choking coughs finally subsided, his mind spinning so wildly that he could not tell where he was or what had just happened, only that his body ached as if the entire world had crushed him flat. The dull patter of rain on the tree canopy above, the sharp scent of mud and murky river water filling his nose and making him dizzy, all blended into a haze until a small, gentle voice rose beside him. "Are you hurt, sir? Do not move yet." His eyes opened, and once more he saw the little girl's face, streaked with mud, her dark brown hair matted by the rain, yet her eyes astonishingly clear. She knelt beside him, her oversized yellow raincoat glistening with water, one hand carefully lifting his head while the other pulled from her pocket a worn handkerchief. "You are bleeding on your forehead," she said with worry. "Probably hit a rock under the river." Nathaniel blinked as a throbbing pain at his temple confirmed she was right, the blood from a small cut sliding down to mix with the rain on his face. She pressed the cloth there gently. He was not used to being touched, even less to being tended to with such tenderness by a child. An instinct made him want to push her hand away, but her eyes held him still. There was no fear in them, no calculation, only a sincerity so simple it bordered on absurd. His voice scraped out, rough as if wrapped in cotton. "Who are you?" She did not look up, still patiently holding the handkerchief to his wound. "I am Sophie Bennett. My house is near here," she said, pausing before asking, "What is your name?" He meant to lie, a reflex honed through years of survival, a false identity rising instantly to the front of his mind. But the expectant openness in her eyes made the lie catch in his throat. "Nate," he said shortly. "Just Nate." She nodded as if that answer were perfectly sufficient, asking nothing more, pressing nothing he was not ready to give. "Mr. Nate, you are very cold," Sophie whispered as she glanced at his clothes soaked in mud and river water. "My mom once told me if someone stays wet too long they get a fever," she added in a hushed tone as though sharing a secret. "You can borrow my raincoat for now." She shrugged the raincoat off, hesitated for a heartbeat, then spread it over his chest. It was thin and small and covered almost nothing, yet a strange warmth started to bloom inside him. It was not the flimsy nylon fabric but the act itself. He had bought loyalty with money, secured obedience with threats, and silenced people with violence. But this was the first time in his life he had been given something without having to trade anything in return, a kindness that asked for nothing. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, genuinely baffled. Sophie looked at him and lifted her shoulders in a small, simple shrug. "Because you need help. I cannot just walk away." A reply so pure it made his chest tighten. She did not know who he was, did not know what he had done, did not know that the hands she was tending had been stained with blood, and perhaps because she did not know she was able to look at him as a person, not a name in a file, not a shadow in the underworld, but a human being who had just escaped the blade of death. The rain thickened, falling harder. Sophie looked up when she heard the faint sound of cars echoing from the distance. "I have to go," she said softly. "My grandma will worry. You should stay still. Do not get up yet. Someone might come." She stood, stepped back, but her eyes lingered on him. Nathaniel wanted to stop her, wanted to ask more, but all he managed was a strained whisper. "Thank you." Sophie smiled, light as a breath. "You are welcome, Mr. Nate." Then she turned and ran, her small figure dissolving into the misty rain, leaving Nathaniel lying there with the yellow raincoat across his chest, his heartbeat stumbling out of rhythm, something unfamiliar spreading slowly through him. He did not know exactly what had just happened, only that after so many years living in the shadows, a tiny hand had pulled him from the deepest pit within himself, and it was not only the fall into the river he had survived, but the fall away from the man he once believed he could only ever be. The sound of a distant car horn drifted through the rain, followed by flickering beams of light cutting through the thick curtain of water, and Sophie turned toward the noise, her eyes flashing with an instinctive alertness. She bit her lip, then bent down and pulled the yellow raincoat off her small body without a word, folding it quickly and pressing it gently against Nate's forehead where the blood still seeped in a slow, stubborn line. "Keep this with you. It will stop the bleeding, and it is warm too," she murmured as she laid the coat on his head with a tenderness that seemed almost afraid to cause pain. The raincoat was thin, torn at one sleeve, its yellow dimmed by mud and water, yet it carried a faint scent all its own. Not of perfume or soap, but of something older, the smell of wind and books and a strange kind of quiet gentleness. Sophie looked at him one last time, her eyes flickering with something he could not name, not pity and not fear, but an unconditional care, as though she had long been accustomed to taking care of others. "I have to go. My grandma will worry. You must not stand up on your own. It is too dangerous," she said, her voice nearly lost in the rain but clear enough for Nathaniel to hear every word. He wanted to speak, to stop her, to ask how a child could do what so many adults would have stepped back from, but the words lodged in his throat as if saying them aloud might shatter the moment. Sophie stepped backward toward the dirt road, her small shoes leaving shallow, muddy prints on the soaked ground, and as the approaching headlights brightened, she turned to look at him one last time. That look, in a single heartbeat, stamped itself into Nathaniel's mind, not because of her innocence or her smallness, but because in her eyes there was something he once believed he could never trust again, a pure and absolute sincerity with no shadow of doubt, no need to know who he was, no need to know what had brought him to that riverbank, simply one human being seeing another who needed help, and she had offered it without hesitation. Nathaniel lay still, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the rain, his hand lifting to grip the edge of the raincoat, feeling the cold, wet fabric against his skin, and for the first time in many years, he realized he was shaking not from the cold but from something inside him shifting. He had been betrayed by those he trusted most, had lived so long in a world where every act of kindness carried a hidden cost, but that little girl, Sophie Bennett, had saved him without asking for anything in return, without knowing who he was, without flinching at his hardened stare or doubting the expensive suit torn to shreds and the scars that marked his body, simply helping and walking away in silence. When the sweep of headlights passed across the riverbank, Nathaniel turned his head toward the direction where she had disappeared, the rain veiling everything, but the image remained seared into his mind, a small child drenched in the cold downpour, walking as if she were the last light left in the world. And he knew that no matter how many years passed, how many faces he encountered, how many events unfolded, that look, that raincoat, and this moment would never leave him. He did not know why fate had spared his life today, or why it had been a child's hand that pulled him from the abyss, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This debt could never be forgotten, not ever. The rain still had not stopped. Nathaniel lay motionless on the damp ground, his body not yet recovered but his mind drifting far away, and the yellow raincoat resting on him was no longer just a piece of protection from the storm but a gentle, aching reminder that cut open memories he had spent more than 2 decades trying to bury. When he closed his eyes, the first image that surfaced was his mother's face, pale and exhausted under the dim light of their old apartment in the southern end of Boston, the woman who had left him in a cheap rented room on a winter night when he was only 8, leaving behind nothing but a bag of clothes and a crumpled note apologizing for walking away. There had been no father, no relatives, no one who came looking for him, only a lonely child drifting through the temporary care system, shuffled from house to house like an unwanted belonging. He had once been a quiet boy who liked drawing and reading, who believed in goodness, who waited for the day his mother might return, but that hope thinned with every beating, every insult, every time he was pushed out of a home adults pretended to call a family. The first time Nathaniel fought back was at 11, when an older child tried to steal the tattered sketchbook he kept hidden under his pillow. The first time he was arrested was at 13, for stealing bread and milk from a small store to keep himself alive. And it was then he understood the world had no place for the weak, that if he wanted to survive, he had to learn to be feared rather than pitied. At 15, he was taken in as an apprentice by a man named Victor Callahan, who was neither father nor friend, but a crime boss who saw in Nathaniel a cold, intelligent boy with nothing left to lose. Nathaniel learned quickly, questioned little, and soon became the man's most trusted right hand. And when Victor was assassinated at 56, Nathaniel stepped in without challenge, keeping the Callahan name as a symbol no one dared defy. By 25, Nathaniel Callahan was a figure who kept the entire law enforcement system awake at night, a man seasoned crime lords treated with caution. He built his empire through ruthlessness, through decisions that never wavered, through cold laws and the single principle that betrayal would never be forgiven. He did not kill out of pride but out of necessity, each command carving away another piece of his own humanity. And he knew it, yet he believed compassion was a luxury he could never afford in the world he inhabited until today. Until a little girl with fearless eyes looked at him not as a monster but as someone who needed help. Sophie had not cared who he was, had not questioned him or recoiled. She simply acted as though the only thing that mattered was that he was still alive, and that simple truth began to crack through the layers of armor he had carried for so many years. In that brief moment, he had not been a crime boss or a cold-blooded fugitive, but a man trembling in the rain, saved by a child whose heart was far too large for her small body. Nathaniel opened his eyes again as the rain continued to fall, icy water running down his neck, yet something warm and unfamiliar rose within him, a feeling he did not recognize at first, until slowly, piece by piece, he understood. It was the memory of another version of himself, a boy who once believed the world still held goodness, and somehow Sophie had stirred that part of him awake. He felt afraid because he did not know what to do with that emotion, but he also felt grateful because it was not dead after all, not the way he had long believed. Headlights cut through the rain as a black SUV stopped at the riverbank, its tires sinking halfway into the mud. The door swung open, and 3 men in long coats stepped out quickly, moving with practiced precision toward where Nathaniel lay. They did not call out or make noise, all of them trained to avoid drawing attention. Leading them was Tony Marcelli, Nathaniel's right hand for nearly 10 years, and his face drained of color when he saw his boss sprawled in the mud, blood streaking his forehead and an unfamiliar yellow raincoat draped across his chest. "Dear God, Nate, we thought you were dead," Tony breathed, his voice cracking. The other 2 immediately lifted Nathaniel, checking his injuries and wrapping a strip of gauze around his head before helping him stand. Nathaniel pushed them off, forcing himself upright, his eyes fixed on the raincoat now stained with mud. He folded it carefully, holding it as if it were something sacred, a gesture that made Tony frown, but he dared not ask. "Where is Marcus?" Nathaniel rasped. Tony shook his head slowly, his gaze heavy. "We found him a few hundred meters away, trapped in the car." There was no time. Nathaniel's chest tightened as if struck. Marcus Rivera had not been merely a bodyguard. He had been the last surviving companion from Nathaniel's earliest years, long before his name had become one that inspired fear. Marcus had shielded him through brutal street fights and quietly brought him medicine when he was sick and no one else dared to approach. A man whose loyalty needed no oath. A friend if that word could exist in their world. "What happened?" Nathaniel asked, revealing his fury not with shouting but with the sharp silence pressed between clenched teeth. Tony glanced at the other 2 men before speaking softly. "We are checking the cameras around the warehouse. The attack was too fast, too precise. They knew the schedule, even the escape route. It could not have been random." Nathaniel's heartbeat sank. An ambush like that could not have been the whim of a small crew. Whoever planned it had insider information, and if there was a traitor, the betrayal was lethal. He looked toward the river where he would have died if not for the little girl named Sophie. His hand tightened around the raincoat until his knuckles turned white, not from the cold but from the simmering rage rising inside him. Not fury because Marcus had died, but because someone had caused his death. In Nathaniel's world, death was not frightening, but betrayal was unforgivable. He climbed into the SUV without another word, the others following in silence. Throughout the drive away from the riverbank, he neither looked at them nor asked a question. Yet in his mind, every name, every face, every small detail was unwinding like a film played in reverse. Who knew the route? Who sent the last message to Marcus? Who insisted on switching drivers at the last minute? The fragments began to surface, cold and shifting like the river he had just escaped. But one thought refused to leave him. Amid the chaos, the image of Sophie was the only thing keeping him from losing control. A child whose small hand had held him in place when the world tried to pull him under. And now, with the shadow of betrayal taking shape, he knew he had two tasks ahead. The first was to find whoever was responsible. The second was to ensure that no one, absolutely no one, would ever pull Sophie into his world, no matter what it cost. The moment the door opened, Sophie saw her grandmother Martha standing at the threshold, arms crossed, her expression a tight weave of worry and anger. Outside, the rain still drifted in thin scattered drops, darkness swallowing the small-town streets, and the light from her grandmother's grocery shop was one of the few glows remaining in the night. Sophie stepped inside, drenched, her shoes caked with mud, her hair tangled, her forehead slick with rainwater. Martha looked her up and down without a word, then took a towel and wiped her face dry before draping a blanket over her shoulders. "Sophie Bennett," she said, her voice low and stern. "Where were you in this weather?" Sophie bit her lip, avoiding her grandmother's eyes. "I just went for a walk, near the river. After the rain, the air was cool and I wanted to breathe a little." Martha froze, frowning. "Near the river, during a flood. Do you know there was a danger warning?" The news said it clearly. "The water is high, the current strong. You could have been swept away at any moment." Sophie lowered her head, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. "I know. I am sorry." Martha sighed, exhausted. She no longer had the strength to scold the way she once did, but fear trembled through every movement. "My girl, I cannot lose you. I cannot." Her voice cracked at the end, making Sophie look up with tear-filled eyes. The child stepped forward and hugged her tightly, whispering, "I am fine. I only needed some air. I promise I will not go that far again." Her grandmother's breathing softened as her old arms wrapped around the girl, though unease still lingered beneath her ribs, for she sensed Sophie was hiding something. The child usually told the truth, always shared everything. Yet tonight her eyes held something unfamiliar, a small shadow of secrecy. Martha did not press her. She had been a mother and now a grandmother, and she understood that sometimes children needed to keep certain things for themselves. Even so, she could not shake her worry. Sophie said nothing about the man by the river, nothing about pulling a drowning stranger from the flood, nothing about blood or the panic in his eyes or the missing yellow raincoat. She simply slipped into the bathroom, changed her clothes, then sat at the dinner table where her grandmother had prepared a bowl of hot chicken soup. The meal unfolded in silence, each soft clink of the spoon stretching the tension between them. But when Martha saw Sophie close her eyes, take a long breath, and give a weary little smile, she knew the child was trying to appear normal. It was the look of someone who had gone through something enormous, yet was not ready to speak of it. After dinner, when Sophie went upstairs, Martha remained in the kitchen for a long time, her hands trembling as she re-washed the towel she had used on the girl's hair. She did not hear Sophie humming as she usually did, nor the creak of the chair when she sat down to read, only silence draping itself over the small house like a heavy blanket. In her room, Sophie sat on her bed, staring at the window where raindrops streaked long silver lines across the glass. She lifted her hand to her forehead, remembering the warmth of the man's blood that had trickled beneath her fingers earlier that afternoon. She did not know the man's full name, did not know why he had been there, or what had happened before she saw his hand clawing desperately at the rushing water. But one thing she knew for certain, the look in his eyes when she pulled him ashore. It was not the look of a bad man. Even though he had seemed frightening, even though his clothes were torn and his body marked by scars, the expression in those eyes was shock, pain, and something that felt like gratitude. Sophie slid her hand under her pillow and pulled out her notebook, the place where she sketched everything that mattered to her. With her pencil still damp and smudging the lines, she began to draw the yellow raincoat drifting in the river, the man reaching for it, and the small girl straining with all her might to pull him toward shore. No color was needed, no explanation. It was a memory she knew she would never forget. Beneath the drawing she wrote a small, slanted line of words. "I do not know who you are, but I hope you are still alive." Nathaniel's safe house lay deep within the northern forest beyond the town, more than half an hour's drive from the center, disguised as an abandoned repair shop long forgotten by the world. Outside, moss covered the cracked concrete walls, but inside was a sealed, quiet, absolutely secure system that no one could enter without a private access code. When the vehicle stopped at the steel gate, Tony stepped out and scanned his fingerprint, a sequence of electronic tones sounding before the gate slowly lifted. Nathaniel walked in without a word, soaked, his head loosely bandaged, but his eyes sharp and fully awake. The main room remained the same, washed in a dim yellow glow across the walls, lined with diagrams, satellite maps, stacks of documents, and computers ready at any moment. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the metallic cold of gauze and medical tools. A private medic was summoned at once to disinfect and stitch the wound on Nathaniel's forehead. He sat still, making no sound of pain, his gaze drifting toward the corner where he had placed an old fabric bag. Inside, folded neatly and resting with deliberate care, was the yellow raincoat. Nathaniel could not look away from it. At first he thought he kept it only out of instinct, a token marking the moment he escaped death, but now, safe and clear-headed, he still could not set the small thing aside. He sat alone in the room as night fell, the windows shut tight though the forest's voice murmured through the walls, the wind threading through leaves, the thin rasp of insects, and now and then a drop of water falling from a leaky roof onto the concrete floor. On the desk, amid dense folders and maps marking control points, the yellow raincoat lay still, looking like a misplaced fragment of memory. He could not remember the last time he suffered from sleeplessness. In Nathaniel's world, sleep always came quickly and left with precision, never lingering. But tonight the images of Sophie returned again and again. Her eyes, her voice, the small hand pressing a cloth to his forehead, and the moment she disappeared into the rain without making any promises, carrying with her nothing but unconditional trust. He knew her name, knew she lived near the river, and it would not take him long to find her exact address. Before dawn the next morning, Nathaniel drove himself to the residential area on the southern side of town. He parked a short distance away, where a narrow lane led toward the house with the faded sign reading Bennett's Groceries. No one recognized him. With a cap pulled low, sunglasses, jeans, and a gray jacket, he looked like an ordinary laborer, though his eyes remained those of a wolf, always watching. He stayed in his car for hours, tracking every movement around the house. He saw Sophie step outside to carry out a bag of trash, place it by the door, then return inside. A little later, she sat behind the counter with an elderly woman, certainly her grandmother. Nathaniel did not approach, did not reveal his presence, only sat quietly with his hand resting on the steering wheel while his gaze never left the shop entrance. He watched not to control but to protect. Part of him needed to be certain she was safe. Another part, one he could not explain, only knew that whenever he saw her small figure, his mind eased. The next day, and the day after, he returned at different hours. Never at night, never where she might notice him. Only from afar, observing the ordinary life he had never possessed. Sophie often wore thick sweaters, sometimes sitting by the shop's door reading a book, or helping her grandmother wipe down the shelves. She had no idea the man she had saved still watched over her, unaware that with one innocent act she had pulled someone from the deepest edge of his own darkness. Nathaniel did not know what he intended to do next. He had no plan for this, no plan for the feeling lodged inside his chest. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment that yellow raincoat came into his hands, his life no longer remained the same. And now, standing outside the edges of her world, he knew all he could do was keep that distance intact, as if taking one step closer would cause that fragile light to disappear forever. Angelo Salvatore leaned back in a sleek black leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey swirling in his hand, as he gazed through the wide window of the penthouse hotel suite he had just rented in downtown Burlington, the city lights reflecting in his bright yet icy eyes, the eyes of a man who had been raised in darkness. Angelo was only in his early 30s, yet already a name impossible to overlook in the world of underground finance and weapons trafficking throughout the Northeast. He came from the Salvatore bloodline, an old Mafia family that once dominated the docks and shipping routes of New York in the 1990s, a dynasty that had slowly withered after the older generation withdrew, leaving behind a vacuum of power Angelo had sworn to reclaim since he was a teenager. Among all the names ruling the region now, Nathaniel Callahan was the only one he truly feared, and the one he despised most. To Angelo, Nate represented the old world, men with personal codes, mutual respect, unspoken rules that governed an entire shadowed realm. Angelo was the opposite. He believed in speed, technology, ruthless efficiency, and absolute amorality. For him, power did not come from respect but from fear and the total control of information. So when news reached him that Nate would be at a warehouse on the west side of the city to oversee a particular shipment, Angelo made his move. He did not show up in person, but every detail of the plan was his. The ambush position, the escape route, even how to make sure Nate fell into the river without leaving a corpse behind. He wanted the world to believe Nathaniel was dead so he could rise as the default heir, but he misjudged Nate's uncanny ability to survive, misjudged the fact that he still was not ruthless enough to kill a wolf outright, and most of all, misjudged how difficult it would be to dismantle Nate's world. In another room on the same floor, 3 of Angelo's trusted lieutenants combed through surveillance footage, maps marking police positions, and highlighted hotspots throughout the area. Angelo walked past, glancing at the screen. "Any word on him yet?" he asked. One of the men answered, "No body, no trace, but the vehicle is completely wrecked. Chances of survival are very low." Angelo scoffed, lifting his glass for another sip. Very low does not mean impossible. If he is alive, he will come back, and when he comes back, he will be more unhinged than ever. We finish this before he gets the chance to lift his head. He turned away toward his desk, where a large map of weapon routes and financial pipelines was pinned with bright red tacks. Nate's position remained at the center, though Angelo already had a black tack prepared, waiting for the right moment to replace it. No one in the organization knew he was the man behind the ambush. Outwardly, he acted loyal, spoke words of grief for Marcus, even sent flowers to the funeral. But inside, every step had been calculated. Nate was the final obstacle, and if he vanished for good, the entire network would collapse neatly into Angelo's hands like a perfect trap. But there was one thing Angelo did not know. Nate had seen the eyes of the traitor among them. And while Angelo sat high above the city waiting for his victory, somewhere out there Nathaniel Callahan was already returning, carrying with him something Angelo could not manipulate with threats or money: the gratitude of a child and the fury of a man who once believed he had nothing left to lose. In the underground level of the secret base, Nathaniel sat alone before a wide screen filled with streams of encrypted data, the blue glow from the servers casting sharp light across his face, highlighting the old scar along his cheek and the fresh stitches on his forehead. The cup of coffee beside him had long gone cold, untouched. He had not slept for 2 nights. In his mind, every detail of the ambush replayed in slow motion. Each face that appeared that day, every message sent before the meeting, every unusual change in the schedule being sorted through again. And then one name rose above the dry sea of information: Lorenzo, one of the men in charge of logistics, loyal for many years, never once stepping out of line. But Nate did not trust appearances. No one was ever completely innocent, especially in his world. Lorenzo had been the only one who knew the exact meeting location, and the person who switched shifts only hours before Nate arrived at the warehouse. When Tony confirmed he had recently held a secret meeting at a restaurant owned by the Salvatore family, there was no need for further proof. Nate knew he had found the man who had opened the path to the trap that nearly killed him and had taken Marcus's life. He stood and left the basement, the screen behind him continuing to run strings of tracking code. On the other side of the steel door, his men waited. A glance, a nod would have been enough to reduce Lorenzo to dust. But Nate did not nod. He spoke only 3 cold, emotionless words: keep him alive. No torture, no execution, no midnight disposal. Just keep him. The order left the men stunned. Everyone knew Nathaniel Callahan had never forgiven betrayal, but this time he did not act on instinct, because inside him a quiet war had begun. One side knew he had to purge the organization if he wanted to survive. The other side whispered a new question: how much longer did he want to live in this world at all? Every night when he looked at the yellow raincoat, folded neatly in the steel cabinet beside his weapons and classified files, something stirred inside him, a feeling he had spent his entire life burying, a longing to escape, to live as a real human being. But walking away was not simple. His empire was not something he could shed like an old coat. He was the center of a vast power network, a link that, if removed, would plunge everything into chaos. And more than that, the FBI was tightening the noose. A new agent from Boston had just been assigned to Vermont, reopening every old file connected to Callahan. Informants inside law enforcement sent him updates daily. The feds were tracking fake accounts, beginning to plant trackers on vehicles the organization had used. Nate had to change safe houses constantly, sever ties with familiar routes, and let Tony handle all new transactions. He was hiding inside the very world he once ruled. Each time he sat in his car watching Sophie from afar, he asked himself, if the FBI found him, if Angelo made a move against the girl or her grandmother, would he be fast enough to protect them? The question gnawed at him every night. And it was that question that, for the first time in his life, made him sit before a mirror and imagine a future without gunfire, without kill orders, without traitors, just a man carrying the memory of being saved by a child and choosing to honor that gift by becoming better. But to do that, he would have to step out of the shadow he had built around himself. And that was more terrifying than any courtroom or bullet, because no one in the underworld had ever done such a thing and lived. Not a single one. Sophie's small room sat on the second floor above the old grocery store, its window facing the river that had grown gentle again after the storm, and in recent days the weather had been softly sunny, the late autumn air carrying the scent of dry leaves and a pleasant chill. Sophie sat at her desk beside the window, wearing an oversized beige outfit her grandmother Martha had sewn smaller to fit her, her hair tied neatly behind her head, her hands holding a pencil as she drew the first lines on a blank sheet of paper. The picture slowly emerging was the man she had pulled from the water during the great storm. Sophie did not know his name, but she remembered the fear and exhaustion in his eyes, the gray cast of his face, the faint and fading breath that seemed ready to disappear at any moment. Yet what stayed with her most was the moment he opened his eyes to look at her, a gaze hollow and shaken as though he had never seen anyone reach out a hand for him before. She could not forget it. She had told no one, not even her grandmother, because she had made a promise, but in the tender mind of a 10-year-old child, the story could not stay hidden forever, and so she drew. On the page, beneath the pale afternoon light, the image of the man in a crumpled suit, head bloodied, curled on the riverbank slowly took shape. She added the droplets of water rolling down his face, the wide eyes that seemed to be asking why. She knew little about the world beyond her small town, knew nothing of mafia, politics, or crime whispered in the conversations of adults. To Sophie, what she had seen that day was only a person about to die, and she could not look away. She picked up a yellow pencil and carefully shaded the raincoat she had given him, making it the brightest thing on the paper, like a beam of light in the storm. When Martha stepped inside carrying a warm glass of milk, she found Sophie staring intently at her drawing, silent. She glanced quickly at the picture, ready to ask, then chose not to. She knew her granddaughter had a soul far more sensitive than most children. Since losing her mother, Sophie had drawn inward but had also grown strangely deep, speaking little, yet revealing an entire inner world through every picture she created, a world so honest it could break a heart. "Who are you drawing, Soph?" Martha asked softly, sitting beside her. Sophie hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Someone I met. I think he might need a picture to know someone saw him." Martha studied her closely, a faint unease stirring within her, but she asked nothing more. There were things children felt with their hearts that adults, no matter how hard they tried, could never fully explain. Sophie carefully signed the corner of the paper in her small but sure handwriting. "Sophie Bennett, for you, the man who did not give up." After finishing her milk, she placed the drawing on the desk, studying it for a long moment as though trying to memorize every feeling she had poured into it. Not pity, not fear, but a simple belief. If a person fighting for his life still held on, then he must have something left to do, something to mend, something to hope for. In Sophie's heart, that strange man was not frightening or dangerous. He was someone unbearably tired, unbearably alone, and someone who had once been pulled back from the edge by a fragile thread called human kindness. And though no one knew, though no one praised her, Sophie believed one thing, with all her small and unwavering certainty. If anyone had ever been saved by goodness, then the world still held something worth trusting. The meeting took place on a Thursday night inside an abandoned warehouse at the edge of a long deserted industrial zone, a light drizzle falling just hard enough to turn the ground to mud and scatter warped reflections of headlights across the cracked concrete. Angelo arrived early, radiating the arrogance of a man convinced he held the winning hand. He wore a charcoal coat, stood between two young bodyguards, hands in his pockets, chewing gum as though he were attending a casual gathering. Nate entered through the back door with no bodyguards, no visible weapon, only the tall, lean frame that had grown thinner after the ambush, yet carried eyes still sharp as razors. In his hand was a thick envelope containing copies of the evidence of the meeting between Lorenzo and Angelo photos, recordings, everything. He set the envelope on a wooden crate between them without speaking. Angelo glanced at it but did not touch it. He knew exactly what was inside, knew every piece because he had orchestrated the plan himself. What he had not counted on was Nate surviving, and what unsettled him even more was that Nate had not ordered his death. "What can you do, Nathaniel?" Angelo jeered, his voice laced with mockery. "This world no longer belongs to men like you. You are soft now, sentimental, hesitant. Those things will kill you sooner or later." In his gaze there was no fiery anger, no familiar hatred he once carried when dealing with traitors, only a strange, cold calm, as though he were staring at a wall he had seen too many times. "I did not come to kill you, Angelo, but you will not get a second chance." His voice was low, steady, each word landing heavy in the damp air. "Do not touch my people again. Stay out of my territory. And do not ever think I do not know what you are doing." Angelo scoffed and turned away as if the warning were nothing more than a light scratch, but he froze when Nate reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was Marcus's ring, belonging to the loyal driver who died on that stormy night. Nate placed the ring on the envelope, his gaze never leaving Angelo. "I am sparing you not because I am weak. I am choosing another path, but do not mistake mercy for helplessness." Then he turned and walked away, leaving without another word. His footsteps echoed evenly across the wet concrete, unhurried and resolute. Angelo said nothing, but his eyes shifted. Behind his smirk simmered a dark anger, wounded by the unmistakable disdain in Nate's decision. For a man like him, being spared was not luck but humiliation, and Nate's restraint planted a seed of dread, a realization that he was being handled by someone he could not predict. Inside Nate's organization, whispers began to surface. Tony overheard murmurs at transfer points, rumors that the boss had changed, that he was losing his edge, that the Callahan era was ending. A few younger faces quietly reached out to Angelo, testing the waters. Tony brought all of it to Nate during a private meeting, lit only by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. "They doubt you," he said. "They do not understand why Angelo is still alive." Nate remained silent, eyes fixed on the window where the rain still fell lightly. "They do not need to understand," he said after a moment. "They only need to see the result." Tony frowned. "But if the result is peace without blood, they will no longer believe in your strength." Nate shook his head slightly. "True strength does not come from making people fear you. It comes from making them afraid to question you." The line left Tony wordless. He did not fully grasp what Nate was pursuing, but he knew the man once called the White Wolf was changing, and whatever those changes meant, hope or danger, they could no longer be stopped, because they had begun on the day a little girl in a yellow raincoat reached her hand into the rushing water. That weekend a soft drizzle fell, and Sophie curled up in the corner of her room beside the old wooden desk, holding the purple ink fountain pen Martha had bought her for her birthday. On the first page of her floral-covered notebook, she wrote in round, careful letters, "Diary of Sophie Bennett, the story of the man by the river." She was not sure what she should write, but the emptiness she had felt in the days since she last saw the stranger pushed her to record every small thing she remembered. She wrote about the cloudy eyes that still held a flicker of life, about the rasp in his voice when he asked her name, and about the way he held the yellow raincoat in both trembling hands as though it were a precious treasure. Sophie did not know why that image clung to her mind, only that if she did not write it down, the feeling inside her would keep sweeping through her like a hidden tide. On the first pages, her writing was hesitant, sometimes repetitive, but slowly the words began to flow, as if the pen itself understood what Sophie could not yet say aloud. She did not use his real name, calling him only the stranger in the suit, or the man with the sad eyes. Yet she described every small detail, the cut on his forehead, the heavy breath, the scarred hands, the voice that sounded as though night winds had blown through it for many years. Every night, after finishing her homework and reading, Sophie opened the notebook and wrote a few lines. Some nights she wrote only a single question, such as, "I wonder if he still remembers the little girl who saved him." Or, "When he feels sad, what does he do to feel better?" She wrote with the full sincerity of a child who knew no fear, who did not judge, who simply wanted to understand a person she had once seen so lost in the world. One afternoon, while Sophie was at school, Martha tidied the room and accidentally found the notebook beneath the pillow. She had not meant to read it, but the moment she turned the first page, her eyes froze on the lines describing the event at the river the day the storm struck. She kept reading, beginning in shock, then sinking into rising worry, as she saw how Sophie described the scene, the voice, the emotions she felt while helping the badly injured man. Each line read like a quiet confession, tightening her chest. Who was this man? Why had Sophie not told her? And what if he was not a good person? She remembered the recent reports on television about criminal turf wars. Men shot dead, men disappearing, the FBI hunting down a mafia boss. No one knew the true identity of the figure at the center, but she remembered the cold eyes and the blurry security camera images. A chill ran through her as she sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the notebook trembling in her hands. She was not angry at Sophie, only terrified for her. A 10-year-old child, living in a poor neighborhood, trusting easily, carrying a heart far too big, had accidentally stepped into the orbit of a stranger whose identity was unknown. She could not know who he was, but the instincts of a woman who had once lost her daughter told her that something dangerous was hidden between those tender lines. When Sophie returned home, Martha said nothing about the notebook. She simply watched her more closely, searching each expression, each pause in her voice. Sophie was still lively, obedient, quick to smile, but whenever Martha asked about the afternoon after the storm, the girl gave the same answer as always. I just took a walk by the river. Martha knew she had to do something, yet she also knew that pushing too hard would make the child withdraw into herself. She needed time and calm. Her aging heart prayed that the man would never return, prayed that the whole thing would fade like a passing rain, leaving no trace behind. But deep inside, she understood that once someone imprints themselves on a child's mind through life and death, they do not vanish easily, not as if they had never been there at all. Ever since Nate read the lines in Sophie's diary, his mind had not known a single moment of peace. He had not expected the little girl to remember every detail of that day so vividly, and even less had he expected those memories to be kept with such tenderness, as though they were a fragile treasure of the spirit, a fact that moved him deeply even as it unsettled him. Though he had never revealed his identity to her, he knew that anything connected to him could bring danger to the child and her family. Old enemies, opportunists within his own ranks, and even the watchful eyes of law enforcement were all potential threats, so he decided to do the only thing he could, protect her from afar. During the following week, without anyone knowing, Sophie's neighborhood began to see the quiet presence of two unfamiliar men. They carried no flashy weapons, wore no black suits like in the movies, only appeared as two middle-aged men dressed simply, sometimes seated on a park bench by the playground, sometimes sipping coffee silently in the corner shop down the street. They took turns watching the area around Martha's grocery store, around the route Sophie walked home from school each day, never interfering, never approaching, only memorizing every unfamiliar face that passed through. They had been trained to avoid raising suspicion, yet they were prepared to act the moment anything seemed amiss. Nate kept out of sight, left no trace, yet every report found its way to him each night. Though no longer the king seated on a throne of power, his network still operated quietly, tightly, loyal to orders spoken in a silence more terrifying than commands shouted aloud. Everything remained calm until a Tuesday afternoon, when a fine mist of rain began to fall, and Martha, bent over her work, was closing the shop early to keep the damp from damaging the goods. A tall man in a cap approached the storefront, hands tucked into his coat, eyes flicking about as though searching for something. Martha opened her mouth to speak when she heard hurried footsteps from across the street. Another man dressed like a sanitation worker strode forward and stepped between her and the stranger. He did not raise his voice. It was low and firm when he said, "It's best you walk away." The man in the cap froze, suspicion flaring in his eyes, but he did not test it. He cast one last glance toward the shop and then walked quickly away, as though he had never intended to stop. Martha stared, bewildered, not yet understanding what had just happened before the man in the worker's uniform also turned and disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. But her heart pounded. She was not naive. She understood that silence meant something, and she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Someone was watching her family. That night she sat in the living room long after Sophie had gone to bed, torn between calling the police or remaining quiet. She had no evidence, only the uneasy sense that everything had begun the day Sophie stepped into that fierce rain. She had never seen the man her granddaughter wrote about in the diary, but if he had the power to send people to protect them, that meant he could be more dangerous than anyone she had ever known. In a small room only a few blocks away, Nate read the incident report with narrowed eyes. He recognized the name of the man who had approached the shop, someone with past ties to an old street crew in Queens that had long since dissolved. Perhaps he was seeking information to sell, or worse, looking to settle some forgotten debt. But one warning was enough, and there would not be a second. Nate clenched the report, feeling a strange new emotion rising within him. He had once lived by sowing fear. Now he was learning how to protect someone without leaving his shadow behind. And though Sophie would never know it, he felt this was the only right thing to do, because some debts could not be paid in money or blood. They could only be paid by quietly guarding something pure from the darkness of the world he once belonged to. That afternoon, the small grocery shop felt quieter than usual, the cold settling in, and the soft rain outside keeping even the regular customers off the streets. And Martha was bent over her bookkeeping when the door swung open and the bell above it rang with a sharp, crystalline note. The man who stepped inside seemed to thicken the very air of the shop. Tall, neatly dressed without being showy, with deep-set eyes and a low, steady voice, he walked straight to the counter as though he had always known the place. Martha looked up and froze, not because she had ever met him, but because she had seen those eyes in the pages of Sophie's diary and had imagined this face dozens of times since discovering the story. Her heart stumbled in her chest. He spoke slowly, clearly, without preamble. "Mrs. Bennet, I am the man your granddaughter saved that afternoon by the river." Martha stood still, her hand tightening on the edge of the counter, the worry she had been suppressing for weeks rising suddenly to her throat. He looked at her with no threat in his gaze, only an unwavering seriousness. "I know you have every reason to be concerned, and you are right to be concerned. But I did not come here to bring danger. Quite the opposite. I came to say thank you, and to make a promise." He reached into his coat and set a thick envelope on the counter. Inside were documents establishing a scholarship fund under the name of a fictitious educational foundation, along with a bank account preloaded with enough to cover 12 full years of schooling, including college. His voice remained calm. "This is a gift for Sophie. She saved me from death. But more importantly, she woke something in me that had been asleep for a very long time. Trust. Humanity." Martha stared at the envelope as a storm of questions flooded her mind. Why would a man like him pull Sophie into this? Had he truly changed? Or was this the sweetened leash of a man who had lived by power and blood? Her voice trembled when she asked, "Who are you?" "I could tell you my name," he said, "but I believe you already know. Nathaniel Callahan." Once a name people in this city did not dare say aloud. But I did not come to revisit the past. I came to tell you that since that day, I owe Sophie a debt, and I will never allow anything harmful to come near her. Your family, from this day forward, will always be protected. Not by the old power, but by what I am trying to rebuild: kindness, redemption. The quiet in his eyes made her throat tighten. He did not bow his head asking for forgiveness, yet every word he spoke carried a rare sincerity. She opened the envelope, her eyes sweeping over the numbers and signatures, her heart pounding as she realized this was no trick. Then she closed it slowly. "I do not want money," she said. "I only want Sophie to be safe. I will not tell her anything about this. I do not want her to grow up feeling indebted to a man she does not truly know." Nate nodded. "I do not want her to know. That is why everything will go through an intermediary. No name of mine, no trace. Sophie will simply believe she earned a scholarship for her talent and her kindness. And you will never be harmed for raising a child like her. I promise." They stood that way for a long moment. In the dim winter afternoon light, surrounded by old shelves and jars of peppermint candies, something softened in Martha's chest. She was not entirely convinced, yet she sensed one thing with clarity. This man was not lying. Nate turned toward the door and stepped out, but before leaving he paused, his voice gentler though still steady. "You raised a young hero. Thank you, on behalf of everything I once lost." And then he walked away, leaving behind a faint gust of air carrying the scent of old rain. Martha watched through the window, her hand resting on the envelope as if it grew warm beneath her palm. No gunfire, no threats, only a promise. And she understood that from this moment on, Sophie's life would not be the same, not because the girl knew anything, but because someone out there had placed both his past and his future in the quiet gratitude he held for a child in a yellow raincoat. In the beginning, Martha stood utterly still, as though her entire body had frozen beneath the weight of the truth now laid bare before her. The story she had feared, the lines in Sophie's diary, the vague premonitions she had tried to dismiss, all of it had solidified into reality with a specific name, a specific past, and a man standing directly before her, Nathaniel Callahan. That name was no stranger to a woman who had lived her whole life in this city, a city where rumors moved faster than news, and whispers about the crime boss who had troubled law enforcement for more than a decade felt like dark gusts that never truly left. She pulled her hand away from the envelope as if she had touched something forbidden, her face tightening, her heart knotted with conflict. "You think I would take money from a man like you, after everything you have done? Do you know how many families were destroyed because of the life you chose?" Her voice cracked with anger, with sorrow, with helplessness. Nate said nothing, his gaze calm, as though he had braced himself for every word. He nodded once. "I know. You have every right to refuse. But please, do not let my past be the reason Sophie loses her future. I have done terrible things, and I do not expect forgiveness. But I am trying to do what is right for the first time in a very long time. Let her kindness be the beginning of something clean." Martha pressed her lips together, her eyes falling to the envelope on the counter. She had long given up believing in stories about change and redemption. But then Sophie's face rose in her mind, the orphaned granddaughter who smiled gently even when her shoes were worn through, who quietly gave Martha the better portion at dinner without saying a word, the child whose heart was too large and whose eyes were too clear for a world full of deception. She thought of the girl's future, of the difficult years ahead, if they relied only on the modest income from the aging grocery shop and the dwindling strength of an old woman. She exhaled shakily, her gaze still fixed on the envelope. "But you must promise me this," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "This is my only condition. Sophie can never know. Never. She must grow up believing she earned her scholarship through effort and talent, not because of someone else's blood debt." Nate nodded without hesitation. "I promise. I will not come near her if it makes you uneasy. I only want to make sure she has every opportunity she deserves." Martha picked up the envelope, her hands trembling not because of the money inside, but because she felt herself crossing an invisible boundary, somewhere between morality and love, between reason and devotion. It was not surrender. It was a choice for the granddaughter she loved more than anything in the world. "I am doing this not for you. I am doing this for Sophie. And if one day she learns the truth and is hurt because of it, I will never forgive you." Nate met her eyes, his expression quiet as rain after a storm. "I understand, and if that day comes, you will have every right." He turned and walked out of the shop without looking back, as though he knew that the moment she took the envelope, a thread of fate had shifted. And Martha, standing alone in her small store, held the envelope against her chest and closed her eyes for a brief moment. In her heart she carried only one prayer: that everything that had just transpired would truly become something good, that the kindness of a child might indeed be enough to mend a life that had once chosen darkness as its companion. After his final meeting with Martha, Nate returned to the secluded house on the hill north of the city, the place that had once served as the command center for every covert operation he had run for more than a decade, and he walked into the room filled with files, servers, safes, and the lingering shadow of the life he had lived. But today he was not there to lead, he was there to withdraw. Over the next 3 weeks he quietly arranged everything as a man would when tidying up the remnants of his own legacy. He ordered every remaining illegal operation across neighboring states shut down, disbanded the armed crews, dismantled the laundering channels, and transferred all legitimate assets into a new system, a scholarship fund named after someone he had never forgotten, the Bennett Foundation. The foundation was registered under an independent nonprofit, with a mission to support the education of disadvantaged children across the United States, and no one knew who stood behind it. All they saw was a steady flow of money coming from businesses that had once belonged to Nathaniel Callahan. The law firms and financial offices received precise instructions. If anyone asked, they were to say it was the final wish of an anonymous investor. No ceremonies, no images, no name. Nate wanted every trace erased. Even the men closest to him, like Tony Marcelli, fell silent when they heard the announcement. Tony did not question or protest. He simply looked at his boss as if watching a legend step away from the stage. "Are you sure?" he asked during their final meeting on the rooftop. Nate merely nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I have lived enough for 2 lifetimes in 38 years, Tony. Now I want one peaceful life, a real one." News of Nate's sudden disappearance spread like wildfire. Crime families trembled. The FBI quietly reopened old files, tracking transferred assets. Newspapers spun countless theories: an enemy assassination, blackmail, forced retirement. But no one knew the truth. The name Nathaniel Callahan slowly vanished from federal watch lists, from secret briefings, from whispered conversations on night streets. In the underworld, he was called the Vanished Boss. Some breathed easier, others felt the loss. A few ambitious young men tried to seize the empty space, yet no one dared celebrate, because everyone understood that a ghost like Nathaniel Callahan disappearing in silence meant he had either achieved exactly what he wanted or was preparing something even more terrifying. But only one person truly understood that he had not vanished at all. He was living for the first time, in the truest sense. Each morning, Nate woke early, drank black coffee, and walked quietly through the small garden behind the modest house in the suburbs where no one recognized him. No more guards, no more deals, no more lists of names to kill or control. Only a man wearing a dark shirt with a single item in his pocket, sealed in plastic for safekeeping. A drawing of a soaked, broken man rendered in the unsteady pencil lines of a young girl with a fearless heart. He looked at that drawing every morning, a reminder of the moment when a soul that had nearly gone beyond saving was pulled back toward the shore by a child, and he believed that a life could begin again if one had the courage to end it at the right time. 5 years had passed since that fateful rainy afternoon by the river, and Sophie Bennett, now 15 years old, had grown taller and steadier, though her eyes still held the same unspoiled clarity they had on the day everything changed. She lived with Martha in the small apartment above the old grocery shop, a place that always smelled faintly of warm bread and cinnamon, and Martha watched every step her granddaughter took as though her own heart were tethered to the child's every breath. Though she never spoke of it, ever since reading that secret diary entry about the drenched stranger, she had carried a quiet, persistent worry. But time had passed, and Sophie remained the kind, artistic, gentle child she had always been, never once mentioning the past. Until one autumn morning, when a thick cream-colored envelope appeared on their doorstep, Martha opened it with the uneasy intuition that had shadowed her for years. Inside was a formal letter from an organization called the Bennett Foundation, along with a provisional admission notice and a full scholarship offer from the New England Academy of Art in Boston. Sophie had been invited to a special national selection for exceptional young students, and the scholarship covered every cost: tuition, housing, books, even travel expenses for her guardian on special occasions. Martha froze. No one in their family had ever heard of this foundation. No one in the neighborhood had sent any application to Boston. Sophie stood beside her. Fingers knotted together as Martha read the letter aloud, her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. Attached to the envelope was a simple handwritten note in black ink, unsigned. A girl with a heart of gold deserves the most beautiful things. Let her light shine. Sophie turned to Martha, her voice trembling. "Grandma, is this real?" Martha pulled her close, caught between joy and worry. She knew the academy was one of the finest schools in the country, meant only for the gifted, the resilient, the truly extraordinary. But she also knew, better than anyone, that Sophie possessed more than talent. She carried a heart so bright and brave it softened even the harshest souls. Martha whispered the only question that mattered. "Do you want to go? Even if it means being far from me and from this place for a while?" Sophie lowered her gaze, her voice unsteady but firm. "If it helps me draw better things, if it lets me do something that matters, then I will go." In the days that followed, their small neighborhood brimmed with a subtle sense of celebration. Everyone knew Sophie could draw, but no one expected a renowned academy in distant Boston to call her name. No one knew who stood behind the scholarship, though whispers filled the air, perhaps a generous stranger who had once visited the shop, or a teacher who had quietly admired her work at a school fair. Sophie did not answer. She was not sure herself, though deep inside her lived a quiet image, a drenched man with gray eyes, looking at her as though he had never before seen anyone reach out with pure kindness. Sometimes, sitting alone by the window with a pencil in hand, she would sketch him again from memory, not fierce, not cold, only with that silenced gratitude that had stayed with her for years. She never told anyone, not out of fear, but because something about it felt sacred. And now, standing before a new doorway in her life, Sophie did not know that the man who owed her his life was living quietly in a small town hundreds of miles away, rising each morning to brew his coffee, stepping onto his porch, and looking toward the east, where Boston welcomed a new autumn wind, and where a small, bright star was about to begin its journey into the light. On the final afternoon of the school year, the junior high campus where Sophie studied buzzed with laughter and excited chatter, golden balloons tied along the hallway, and a sign reading "Middle School Graduation" hanging proudly above the small stage in the courtyard. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged. Parents sat among children dressed in blue ceremonial robes that shimmered with hope, and at the very back, in the shade of an old maple tree, a man stood quietly apart from every curious glance. Wearing a simple black jacket, sunglasses, and a cap pulled low, he still could not hide the steady posture and weathered face beneath. Nate did not take his eyes off the girl in the pale yellow dress stepping toward the podium, and the heart he once believed hardened beyond repair now trembled with a renewed, fragile pulse. Sophie climbed the wooden platform, her hands trembling around the small paper in her grasp, though her gaze shone bright and steady. She did not begin by reading her speech. Instead, she lifted her head, looked out at the people gathered, and started with a soft but resonant line. I was taught that kindness is a light that never goes out, even on the darkest days. The courtyard fell silent. Sophie continued, her voice small but unwavering. There was an afternoon in the rain, when I was much younger. I cannot tell the whole story, but that day I learned that even as a child, I could make a difference, even the smallest one. Martha brushed away her tears. Nate tightened his grip on the railing behind him, revealing nothing outwardly, though every word Sophie spoke pierced through the quietest, buried corners of his heart. I do not know what waits for me ahead, Sophie said, but I know this. Wherever I go, I will carry one belief with me that one good action, one hand reaching out at the right moment, can save someone, and it can change you too. The rows below erupted into applause, a few teachers embracing through their emotion. Sophie bowed her head and stepped down, her face calm, as though she had completed a great mission. Nate did not move. He did not approach her, and he did not leave. He simply stood there, a shadow in the early summer light, watching the person who had changed him without ever knowing it. In all the years behind him, he had witnessed hundreds, thousands of meetings, tense negotiations, bloodshed, betrayal, loyalty purchased and lost, but nothing had ever made him feel what he felt now: peace. Not the hollow quiet of power, nor the fearful silence of those who obeyed him, but a peace born from a softened soul, from knowing he had been right to step away, right to protect rather than destroy. Sophie walked toward the seats and accepted a small bouquet of flowers from Martha. Nate watched the two embrace, then turned and walked away. He did not need gratitude. He did not need to be recognized. He only needed to know that she was safe, that she was whole, that she was stepping into her future with her bright heart unbroken, and that was enough. He disappeared into the crowd, folding back into the city, carrying with him her voice, her eyes, and the small light that had once reached into the darkest part of his life, and he knew he would continue forward, but never again down the road he once walked. Martha held Sophie's hand as the two of them stepped out of the school grounds, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the courtyard like liquid gold. The graduation ceremony had ended, yet the echo of applause, congratulations, and Sophie's speech lingered in the air like a gentle dream. Martha did not say much, only smiled warmly each time Sophie chattered about how it felt to stand on the stage, to see her friends one last time in their uniforms, to receive a bouquet from her homeroom teacher. But as the crowd slowly dispersed, Martha suddenly stopped. Her eyes caught the silhouette of a man standing beneath the line of trees across from the school gate. Dark jacket, a cap pulled low, his posture slightly bent, walking slowly as if hoping no one would notice him. Yet no matter how carefully he tried to hide, she recognized him. That face, that gait, that quiet presence. She had seen it once on a rainy afternoon 2 years before, inside her little grocery shop, when he stepped through her door with a thank you and an envelope that could change Sophie's future. It was Nate, not the crime lord whose name once troubled the police, but the man her granddaughter had saved, who had chosen to protect the girl silently for years without leaving a trace. Martha stood still, watching him walk away and disappear into the flow of cars rolling past the street ahead. No greeting, no nod, just a quiet retreat like a ghost who had completed his final duty. Sophie kept talking cheerfully, unaware of the direction Martha's gaze had wandered. She tugged her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, can we go home now? I'm starving." Martha blinked and smiled, her expression smoothing like a pond after a passing breeze. She brushed a hand over Sophie's hair and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, you did wonderfully today." On the entire walk home, she said nothing about the man she had seen, never hinted that someone who once lived in the shadows had stood there watching Sophie take her next step in life. She knew some things were meant to stay behind, not out of secrecy, but because kindness did not always need a name, and gratitude did not always need to be spoken. Sometimes it was enough for one person to know and one person to remember. That night, after Sophie fell asleep with her arms wrapped around the wilting bouquet, Martha sat alone in the dim living room, the soft lamplight blurring against the window pane. On the table lay a drawing Sophie had made recently. A man standing by a riverbank, the water raging behind him, a small girl in a yellow raincoat facing him. The details were simple, almost vague, but the man's eyes darkened with pencil held something strikingly real, something deep, as though they were looking out from another world. Martha brushed her fingertips across the paper, her heart softening. Perhaps the child remembered too, but instead of asking, she chose silence. She knew that if the truth ever needed to be told, Sophie would be the one to begin it. For now everything remained intact. A kind-hearted child, A man who had rediscovered his humanity, and a grandmother standing between their two worlds, preserving what was most sacred, a life saved by compassion, without condition, without judgment. She lifted her gaze toward the street outside, now dark and still, as though hoping she might see that figure once more. But there was only wind, and the soft sway of trees in the gentle night. On the desk of a small house tucked quietly into the suburbs, a single framed painting sat neatly in place, a watercolor piece, not particularly refined, yet carrying a sincerity that could reach straight into the heart. It was a yellow raincoat stretched out beneath a gray sky, each painted raindrop falling softly as though in silence. There was no face in the picture, no name, only that raincoat, an emblem of courage, of unconditional kindness, of the moment when a soul nearly swallowed by darkness was pulled back into life by a tiny, unexpected beam of light. It was the final painting Sophie had made that school year, slipped into a thin envelope addressed simply to the founder of the Bennett Foundation. And though she did not know his personal address, the letter found its way exactly where it needed to go. Nate opened it on a peaceful afternoon, sunlight stretching across the wooden floor like a quiet blessing, and when he looked at the painting, he saw not only the raincoat Sophie had given him that day, but also himself silent, fractured by the tug-of-war of his past sins, and redeemed not by bullets or power, but by the untouched kindness of a child who had never learned to fear someone like him. From that moment on, the painting became the most precious object Nate had ever owned. No amount of money, no towering building, no empire could compare. He kept it in the living room of the modest apartment he now called home, living a simple life with no name, no shadow, no darkness. He often sat before the painting for hours, and each time he did, his heart felt calm, as though nothing had ever stained it. And elsewhere, Sophie continued to grow, continued to write in her diaries, continued to draw, and still wore the new yellow raincoat Martha had bought her, a bright golden hue, like a sunbeam on a rainy day. She had no idea that the small act she once considered ordinary had reshaped the fate of a man, and she never thought of herself as extraordinary. She simply believed that helping someone was what one ought to do. Yet it was precisely this simplicity that made the world gentler. The story ends here, but its echo will linger in each of us. You see, sometimes a single small action can save an entire life. We do not need to be grand heroes. We only need to be good at the right moment, in the right place, in the right way. A gentle question, a hand reaching out, a heart unafraid of being hurt. Through this touching story, we hope to share a simple human truth with you. Kindness never goes out of style, and often the thing that transforms a person is not punishment, but forgiveness and the quiet light of genuine compassion. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so more people can feel its warmth. We would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever met someone like Sophie? Or have you ever helped or been helped by someone with no expectation at all? Share your story below so we can listen to a piece of your heart. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. May you always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace, happiness, and fullness. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.